My name is Clancy. I'm an alcoholic. That foreigner drank all the water.
There's a jug underneath.
Pardon me?
There is a jug underneath.
But it's so hard to drink out of this. I'm very glad to be here tonight. I want to tell Russ how much I enjoyed his talk. I don't know who this sponsor of yours is, but he sounds to be a very wonderful man. And I'm glad to be here. I want to take just a minute, if I may, tonight to... I want to really express my appreciation to a number of people. I think this has been as memorable a week equally as memorable as any week I've ever had in my life. I want to thank very much Travers, who has been an excellent host. Traveling around the British Isles this week, I had a feeling, I didn't know what it was, but it came to me today. It must have been just like being the Prince of Wales going through the Dominions. Everywhere I went, people would carry my bags and take care of things, and I was just looking for Wallace Windsor to make my life happy, but it was a wonderful time, and Travis was assisted by his two assistants. There's Richie and Mike, who play on the road Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to his Hamlet, and it really is a remarkable traveling show, and I'm glad to be part of it, I'll tell you that. We went up to Scotland, as I mentioned, had a great time up there. Raymond wore his kilts and allowed me to ridicule him, and that cheered me up a little bit. Now I've learned a little more Scottish. I don't like to use it up, and some of you Brits might not understand it, but we Scots do. I noticed the slogan of this meeting is "Action is the magic word." That's not what we say up in Glasgow. We say, "Dinna say it, day it." And then we went to Dublin, where Eugene and some of his other folks we had a wonderful day in Dublin, walking through the streets, and as I mentioned again last time, we went to Northern Ireland and drove up there through the checkpoints, and it was an amazing thing. I was thinking about that. I believe it must be true. The only place in that troubled land where Republicans and separatists and Catholics and Protestants sit in absolute peace is Alcoholics Anonymous. I have no reason to think so, but as far as I could tell, the people there were just all sorts of hues. And Nigel was such an excellent host, and his sponsor, Felix. And we met people who were Republican Catholics, and we met people who were separationist Catholics, and we met separationist Protestants, and they all trooped in and sat down together and drank that hideous coffee and smirked and shook hands and felt good and went out, and I don't know what they did when they got out. But that is as good a testimonial to AA as I know. I'm sure there would be that much peace in a church of any denomination. So it really is a great testimonial. And then we came back here and I want to again thank Travis. He took me to London, and I saw everything that I'd read about. We really moved around. We were whizzing around, and then to Bath today, had a great time in Bath. And tomorrow morning I have to go back. It's going to really be dreadful. I leave London at 11. I get into Los Angeles at 2:55. Coming home, the Prince of Wales, from one of the great all-time triumphal tours of the continent, or the British Isles, and at 4 o'clock, the Prince of Wales has to take out the garbage. And be told by my Al-Anon how to pilot on the curb, so it'll be convenient for the trash man. That's what AA is about, I guess, to help you with. I want to say just a few words about sponsorship tonight, because I think sponsorship is probably, I would think, the most important single help that people have on a continuing basis. It's nice to be sponsored, but one of the greatest things is sponsorship, the art of giving. We talked about this briefly up in Scotland the other day. How Bill Wilson stayed sober for several months and tried to help people and tried to help people and tried to help people, and not one of them ever stayed sober. And he finally said to his wife, I think I've been kidding myself. I'm not going to do this anymore because not one of the people I've tried to help has stayed sober. And she said something that saved your life and mine. She said, "It must be working, Bill. This is the first time that you have ever stayed sober." And he began to realize his actions of helping others was keeping him sober despite how they received it. And so he stayed sober a while longer and got to Akron to meet Dr. Bob and eventually to start this fellowship that we're at. And I think about what Dr. Bob said in his last talk. Some of you have heard that tape or read it. He was very sick and he was dying of cancer, so we didn't really go into anything much, but that's where he said things that he made a few little points like we don't have to worry about big scientific things in AA that are of interest to scientists. We are interested in recovery. Everything else is extraneous. But he says it boils down to two things: love and service. And we all know what love is, and we all know what service is. We can sit around and debate how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, but it still boils down love and service. But later on in that very short talk, he said, we must never be too busy to turn around and give a pat of encouragement to that man behind us. Because he said, none of us would be here if someone ahead of us hadn't taken the time to teach us how to live. And that certainly is true. Sponsorship is great to get, and it helps a great many of us. But it's greater to give, I think. But sometimes people wonder, why do you have to have a sponsor? Why would people have to have a sponsor? You've come here, you've got a way to go. Why not just do it and live? And I think that is the conundrum of Alcoholics Anonymous, that to many outsiders and to newcomers and to some people who stay in their intellectual ivory tower are afraid to come out into the world. And I think that's why we tell our stories. I just want to a little bit explain why I have a sponsor. As some of you have heard, I grew up in a little town in northern Wisconsin, which is in the middle of America. It's a town much smaller than Bristol, much smaller than Bath. Very small little town. And early in the Second World War, I was full of enthusiasm. I was 15 years old, and I had been reading with I was a great avid reader and an avid enthusiast. I'd read about the Battle of Britain and how Britain had weathered through, and we were coming back, and we'd been bombed, and now we were fighting back, and I wanted to get up to that war before it ended. I wanted to get out there and kill some Japs. And I didn't know much. I grew up in a little town in a very religious community. I'd never had the exposure to anything. I knew nothing, but I thought I knew a lot. And I decided to hitchhike to San Francisco. Now that's a little over 2,000 miles. I had no idea how far. I looked in the map in the school library, just a page and a half, didn't seem bad. And it showed there were blue states and yellow states between there. I wanted to see one of those. But I got out there. I don't know how I got there. One guy gave me a ride most of the way around. He certainly died. And I was a dumb little kid, this big, with a face full of pimples and stupid. And I tried to tell this guy, I said, I want to go in the Marines, and I'm going to kill chaps like John Wayne. And he said, I'll tell you, kid, you may not be ready for that right away. He said, I'll tell you what you do. I don't think you can get in the Marine Corps at the moment, but the merchant service is crying for seamen. And if you'd go there and tell them you were 16, you might be able to somehow get into the merchant service. I said, okay. So he showed me how to put me on a ferry to San Francisco from Oakland. And I walked up Market Street, and I was excited because San Francisco was exciting. I'd never seen a big town before. You know, just, oh. And I found the Coast Guard office down in there, and I told them I wanted to be a merchant seaman. I guess they were crying for merchant seamen because a little dumb, stupid thing like me, he gave me an application for seaman's papers, and I filled it out, and I remember to put in 16. And he said, well, you're only 16, son. We'll have to have your parents approve this. So I took it around the block and had my parents approve it. And that day, they issued me seaman's papers. That's how much training I had. And they referred me to the National Maritime Union down Montgomery Street, and I slept down there. Oh, never smelled an ocean, never done anything, a dummy. And they were crying for merch, and they'd be signing a waiver saying I could take my union dues out of my first check, and they said, rush over to the Embarcadero, and here's this pier, get on the ship, they're about ready to go. And I rushed over there with my little bag, and I got down there, and there's enormous ship. And, oh! Today I know it wasn't. It was a dumb little Liberty ship, you know. But then it's bigger than anything that had ever been in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And I got on that baby just as they were about to leave. And I'll tell you, the golden moment of my life, one of the golden moments, on a ship, a big thing, and it's moving up, and it's moving under the Bay Bridge. I went, oh. And by Alcatraz, and, oh. Looking for Al Capone. And under the Golden Gate Bridge, and oh. God, I couldn't believe it. I'd seen these things in newsreels. It just made me want to puke. And then it just kept going. And I noticed the known Earth was going out of sight. And I had an intuitive feeling, I guess, that I had made the first in an endless series of career errors. I sidled up to somebody who looked like he was an authority, and I said, I really appreciate this opportunity, but I should get back now. We have a big English test Monday. I didn't want to... And he told me to shut up. He said, get to your forecastle. I didn't know what a forecastle was. It sounded ominous to me, I'll tell you. Sure, most of you have been on a ship know what a forecastle. That's where the crew sleep, a series of rooms. And I found the room I was supposed to be in, and in each room there was a watch. I was in the deck watch, and one of the watches in the deck crew. And there were four, I guess, I've discovered later, 4 guys in each one of these watches. But all I knew is I came into a room carrying my little bag, and I saw 3 of the worst type of people that any small, skinny, pimply-faced, dumbbell kid can ever see. And these kind of people are called men. And they all looked at me with horror. I didn't know why, but I realized later. They realized I was supposed to carry 1/4 of the load, and they realized I wouldn't. And I could see there was a little tension, so I told them some little jokes that used to sound good in study hall at high school. And they just, why don't you shut your goddamn mouth? Why don't you get in your bunk? And I got in my bunk, and I'll tell you, I really felt bad. Now the ship was moving, and there was no way I was ever going to get home again. And these people were mean. and I wanted my mother. But I didn't want to say anything and ruin my image. And I don't know when I ever felt so bad, before or since. And then these guys got talking. I couldn't believe my ears. I was raised in the Norwegian Lutheran Church. You don't have it here. You would have if those Vikings would have kept going a little bit longer. But they quit. Got the Normans in instead. But the Norwegian Lutheran Church is a very strict church. I've talked about this before, but you can't emphasize it too much. You get the feeling sometimes when you go to AA these days that if you come from a strict religion, you're a Catholic. Because there's so many Catholics now, you get up and whine about how mean the nuns are, and it's just so tough. In our home group in Los Angeles, we have 5 nuns, and they get up and whine about how mean the nuns were to them. It's just endless supply of... In my hometown, if you were a Norwegian Lutheran and you couldn't make it, if you were too weak, and you got to find an easier, softer way, you became a Catholic. That's for quitters who just had to play bingo and dance. Norwegian Lutherans, again, I've said this many times, but I want to say it again. Norwegian Lutherans, I believe this is correct, it sounds correct, are people who, even if they were married for 30 years, would never make love standing up. Just in the fear that some passerby would think they were dancing. But I lived a rather secluded life, I'll tell you. And these people got talking on that ship, and I couldn't believe my ears. And I realized they all had dark hair, probably Catholics. I'd heard about them, I'd never seen any. And certainly sinners, because they had been doing things while they'd been in San Francisco with girls that I was appalled. I realized I was in a bad place. And I don't want to leave the wrong impression. Even at the age of 15 in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, I'd had sex. But I'd been apprehensive, and I'd been afraid, and I'd been alone. And then, this kind of talk was it. I couldn't believe my ears, I'll tell you. And I wanted to get out of there. And one of these guys went to his locker, into his sea bag, took out a bottle of whiskey. Of course, we would know now that's absolutely forbidden on a ship, but they all did it. And now can you imagine, to the best of my knowledge, I had never been in the same room with a bottle of whiskey at that time in my life. Never been in the same room with one. And I recognized what it was. I'd seen him in movies. And he turned to one of his friends and says, "You want a little snort?" "Yeah." "Want a little snort?" "Yeah." And he turned to me, and he had a very unpleasant look on his face. Today I'm very sophisticated, and I'm slick, and I've been everywhere. And I'd call it a supercilious look, or a demeaning look, or any one of 100 definitions. Then I just broke looks down into pleasant and unpleasant. And that was an unpleasant look. He said, "How about you, Junior? You think you're man enough for a little snort?" And he shoved that bottle in my face. And I was just so overcome. Something happened to me, and this happened to me many times in my life. Perhaps you've heard of this phenomenon. It's most common in athletics. When the pressure is really on, in a very difficult situation, sometimes an invisible hand comes out of your shirt and chokes you. And you watch the wickets go down behind you. Oh, hell. Or they kick the winning goal, or whatever it might be. That also happens when you're in conversations, I discovered. I could not think of any answer to him. But my mind was going 100 miles an hour. I could just... My mind was saying, "How dare you put that in my face?" I'm a Norwegian Lutheran. Norwegian Lutherans don't drink whiskey. And even if they did drink whiskey, I wouldn't drink whiskey because I promised both my mother and grandmother that I wouldn't drink whiskey. And even if I hadn't promised them I wouldn't drink whiskey, I wouldn't drink whiskey because most of my education in the world was based by seeing movies. I saw a lot of movies in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and in those movies, heroes never drank. Villains drank. Heroes never did. For example, Errol Flynn never drank, that I know of. Never in Sherwood Forest he didn't. There's always some evil craphead like Basil Rathbone or Claude Rains or one of those sneaks. Let's steal the secrets from Queen Elizabeth and send them to King Philip of Spain. Buck Jones never had, he was a, some you don't know, he was a cowboy star. He never drank, ever. Always some rustler named Slade or somebody's name. Let's go kill Buck Jones's horse. There's no chance I'm ever going to drink whiskey. And that big black-haired fink stuck that bottle in my face, said, "You think you're mad after a little start?" And I was just thinking at him as fast as I could. My little pimples were standing right up, just. And I heard a voice say, "God damn right." And I recognized that voice. And that day I had my first drink of whiskey, out of the first bottle I'd ever seen close up. And I took a drink of it, and it burned my mouth, and it burned my throat, and it burned my stomach, and it burned my stomach, and it burned my throat, and it burned my mouth, and burned his shirt the last I saw him. And what I remember most about that moment was their scornful laughter. I don't know very few things in the world that are more painful than public humiliation to inadequate people. Get the bottle away from the little son of a bitch. And I just wanted to die. I couldn't hit him. That, what the hell could I do? I thought later there was one thing I might have done. I'm glad I didn't think of it. They'd have thrown me over the fantail in 2 seconds, but I might have thought of this, All right, buddy, lean over. Yeah, what do you want? Take that. It isn't much, but it's what... But I felt terrible on that ship, as you can imagine. And all the way across the Pacific Ocean, they treated me like a stupid little punk. And I thought it was because they threw up that whiskey. I didn't realize it was because I was a stupid little punk. And so what I was trying to do, every day when nobody was around, I'd get in this guy's sea bag and I'd take a drink of that slop. It'd burn my mouth and throw it up. Then I'd have to wipe it up so they wouldn't see it. And I wanted so bad to look like a man that I would have done anything. And we came into Pearl Harbor finally, around all these big carriers and big ships in here, and they're all up on deck, and I'm down there hitting that stinking bottle again. And I took a drink, and it burned my mouth, and it burned my throat, and it burned my stomach, and it stayed down. I thought, oh God, if I could just do this and smile. As I sat there for a couple months, something changed. I had no idea it was a special thing that happened. It turned out that my body was responsive to alcohol. I had no idea of it, had no way to measure it, and never did. But I got a special effect from alcohol. Over the years, I've watched, and I've been in AA, I've listened to that special effect. Once you hear it, you can hear it all the time. Anytime you hear people talking about why they drank, Russ or anybody else, you get a special effect. What is this special effect? You stay drunk all the time? No. It's physically impossible to stay intoxicated 14 straight days and nights in a row in a laboratory. So when people tell you they stayed drunk around the clock 25 years, they're just rounding it out. One of the rottenest parts about being a drinker is you keep sobering up. You know, if it weren't for that, we'd have very small meetings. You'd have a different speaker tonight, I'll tell you that. Is it that if you're an alcoholic you can't handle it? Nah. You know what the special effect is? Something that people don't know is happening to them. Last year I was at a meeting where a very, very famous and beautiful Hollywood star woman got her 8th birthday cake. And she's so lovely and she's so beautiful and she's known all over the world. She's so talented and she can go to Las Vegas and sing and dance and make $100,000 a week, or she can make movies or dramatic series. You think, why in the world would she ever drink? Someone with all that beauty and talent. And if she got her 8th birthday cake, she just said in passing, as we'd understand, she talked about before she came to AA, she couldn't bear to stay sober. Because when she drank when she stayed sober, she felt unattractive and clumsy and awkward. It was only when she drank that she got a special effect of feeling the way people saw her. I sponsor a big fellow who used to play American football, center. You see it a little bit more over in England now. Big lump. Just tough guy. Talks about how he and one of the guards next to him, out of the whole 49-man team, always had to get back to the dressing room before the kickoff when no one was looking. And they had their pint of whiskey where they could drink it, because without that, he didn't feel he could do it. But once he had that pint in him, he knew he could knock that linebacker in his can. And on and on. Anyone you hear in AA who talks about their drinking, whether they know it or not, if they talk about why they drank, they will talk about a special effect. The special effect is the same thing we talked about last night, but it's hard to remember. It's a change of my perception of reality and my relationship to it. But when it happens, you don't know it's happening. You don't know it's a special reaction. You don't know anything about it. All you know is, if I knew then on that ship what I know now, I would have realized I need some help badly. But I had no way of knowing it. Because what it did, the special effects it had in my life was nothing dramatic, but it was dramatic enough to change my life forever. I drank so that I would look like a man. The special reaction was, it made me feel like a man. Sounds very similar, but it's a million miles apart. And anyone who drinks knows that difference. Not only feel like a man, but feel the way men look, which is unusual, because I found out years later, men don't feel as well as they look. So I was feeling better than they were. But I didn't know that. It filled holes in me that I never knew existed. And I didn't become a ravenous, crazy drunk running through the streets singing sea chanties and crazy drunk. I just thought it was something I learned. And the reason I remember that, I'll tell you a funny coincidence. About a year and a half ago, about 2 years ago, I was asked to, in the summer of 1947, go give a talk at the Naval Hospital at Pearl Harbor for the anniversary of their alcoholic treatment unit or something. And as I was preparing to go over there a couple of weeks before I went over there, it suddenly began to struck me. Geez, there's something here that by the time I got there, I had isolated it. To the best of my knowledge, I had my first drink that I held down on July 8th, 1943, in Pearl Harbor. And the reason I remember that is that the next day was July 9th, and that was my 16th birthday. And I had my first hangover that I remember on my 16th birthday. And by an odd coincidence, They'd asked me to come and speak at the treatment center for this naval hospital on July 8th, 1987. And I found myself getting up and talking. Now, very few people have this opportunity. 44 years later to the day, in the same place I had my first drink, and I could look out the window and see where I drank. And 44 years before, I had been 15 and feeling old. And this year the next day I was going to turn 60. And I was feeling younger than I felt on that ship. It just sent a shiver down my spine because my whole life went in front of my eyes in a sense. Incidentally, in passing, this is a terrible thing to say, but I'm compelled to say it because I think it's cute. I am married to an Al-Anon, as you might guess, and she for many years was obsessed about my life. And I've often thought, I'd like to report anyway, that she almost drowned once in the ocean while she was swimming. And the third time she was going down, my life flashed before her eyes. But I had that drink. It made me feel like a man. I didn't, as I've often said, what it did in a sense, it changed my life. It made me feel the way men look. And many years later, I had my last drink, and I'd become sophisticated, and I'd been clever, and I'd been on a faculty of a major university, and I'd been a successful writer, and I wrote for Life magazine, and I'd had my picture in the New York Times, and I'd been something. And the last drink I ever took, I wouldn't have guessed it then, but I know it now. I took that drink to feel the way men look. I would have never guessed it. I could have blamed it on all sorts of things. Could have blamed it on what I learned in psychoanalysis about my repression and psychological scarring. What I learned in metaphysics about the loneliness of the infinite self reaching forth. My readings in Nietzsche and when I discovered God is dead. By that time, as a Lutheran, I was glad to hear that, I'll tell you. Because if he wasn't, I was screwed. In fact, there's a very famous, a lot of people think God is dead was something over the 60s. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote that in 1884, I believe. One of his characters said, "Why do you worry so much about God? God is dead. He may have started the universe. He may have got the orb spinning, but look at the anarchy about you, the chaos. There's no divine plan. God is dead." And I read that when I was feeling particularly bad, and I thought, I hope that's true. Because if I don't, there's a Norwegian God going to get me bad. In fact, there's a very famous plaque in the Theological Seminary in Chicago. It says, "God is dead," signed Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, 1884. And that makes you feel good to read that. Then you read the second half, and it all goes to hell. It says, "Nietzsche is dead," signed God, 1906. But over the years, I tried to learn to handle alcohol like everybody else does. And I'll tell you, I never had a friend as good as alcohol. Alcohol is the best friend I've ever had. That sounds terrible to say at an AA meeting. How can you? But you know, when I hear people get up at the podium and say things, "That alcohol is just rotten, it always was, just slop, filthy apple." It's like hearing somebody badmouth an old girlfriend of mine, you know. She may be a pig now, but she used to be wonderful. Yeah. Show a little loyalty. Alcohol enabled me to handle things that nothing else ever enabled me to handle. It helped me deal with my continuing anxieties that I had in my life. It seemed to resolve the problems I had I was always ultra sensitive. I felt things too intensely all my life. I always seemed to overreact emotionally. I've had feelings of loneliness that seem to be different than other people seem to have, as far as I can tell by looking at them. I've resented injustice. I've lived with fear a lot. And the trouble with these emotions are, They are wimp emotions. I hated those emotions. I was ashamed of them, and they made me sick, because they're not something you can talk about. They're really not. I remember sitting in a big advertising agency in Dallas, where I was supposed to be slick and hot, and I was. And my boss used to come through, and he was a big, hale fellow, wet melt, and he used to come, and he knew everybody's name. That was his style. There were 6 of us who sat around this little cubicle and wrote words for Elsie the cow to say to her husband and so on. Doesn't sound like much now, but it was very difficult then, I'll tell you. And he'd come through and say things like, "How you doing, Clancy?" I used to think, someday I'm going to have the courage to give this guy a straight answer, just to watch him break his rhythm. I'll tell him the truth. "How you doing, Clancy?" "Oh, I'm afraid." "What are you afraid of, kid?" "I don't know." But I never had the courage to say it. I always said, "How you doing, Clancy?" "Fine." As he was going out, I tried to be cute, say, "Just getting some tired blood out, Morris." I had a tremendous ambition to be something most of my life. I know now that the tremendous ambition I had was so great, it indicated something missing inside. I watched that ambition, and many times there's nothing wrong with that. It's fine. It's better than a lot of things. But when you are missing something inside, when you don't feel that you are of yourself enough, you must get more and more outside to compensate for it. And there's never any end to it. No matter what you get, it's never quite enough. It's only enough for that day, but tomorrow I need more. I gotta keep showing them. I gotta keep doing something. I gotta be something all the time. And there's never enough in the world to keep it going. There's something else I noticed after I got sober and looking back at my life. I'm sure some of you may identify with this, but it's a funny phenomenon that people who don't feel they're quite enough of themselves go through. I drifted into a pattern for years without being aware of it. Where? I required that people treat me special. If they treated me special, I felt average. If they treated me average, I felt rejected. And there's never nobody's going to treat you special forever. But that's why sooner or later my relationships always died out. As they began to treat me as a regular person, I felt they didn't like me anymore. It's hard to identify. It's a funny little thing. We were talking about this the other night, I guess in Dublin or someplace. It's hard to remember that many of us come here with grown-up bodies, grown-up brains, grown-up intelligences, grown-up abilities, all at the intermittent beck and call of childish emotions that were stunted when alcohol began to work. Most of the things I've requested of life as emotionally have almost been at a 16-year-old level, I think, as I look back on them. I wouldn't describe them that way because I was intelligent and I could rationalize and prove that these were realistic things. But one of the things, as I said, one of the things you discover, I want things to stay wonderful. All I ask is that things stay wonderful. Not everything, obviously, because there's a lot of crapheads in the world. But some things should stay wonderful. And I discovered they don't stay wonderful. And I always felt terribly disappointed and sad. And it took me years and years in Alcoholics Anonymous to discover that nothing stays wonderful after you're used to it. Nothing does. But people like me think it's not the way it was. In fact, one of the great examples of that I often use, young men in AA, I'm sure every sponsor in the world has that cross. Young men call up and say things like, I think I found her. I think I'm ready for a meaningful relation. Any sponsor that has been a sponsor more than 20 minutes, when you hear the word relationship coming over the phone, your eyes have a tendency to glaze over and you think, oh, Jesus. Because you've got a long few weeks ahead of you. And it's hard for me to, I hate to disillusion these wonderful young men. I'm just trying to prepare them, but they never listen anyway. But don't think. We were at lunch today, and we reached for the salt, and our hands touched, and I could almost feel a spark. And I really debate whether to tell this kid or not. Because, you know, I'm going to tell you something. I'm not trying to disillusion you or discourage you, but remember the fact it isn't going to stay like this. Yes, it will. It will. And I want to tell them the bad news. 3 years from now, even if you're married with children by that time, and you're deeply in love, and it's wonderful, 3 years from now, when you sit down to eat lunch with her, and you reach for the salt and your hands touch, you're going to say, give me the goddamn salt. Has nothing to do with her. It has something to do with you, you dummy. That's why sometimes in passing we must remember old timers whine that AA isn't the way it used to be. In the old days, we were sincere. We wanted this program. Why would that happen? And I'll tell you a perfect example. I'll give you an illustration from my life, how we old-timers, and I'm an old-timer. You may not think so, but I am. I only need 2 more things to be a perfect old-timer. I need more silver at my temples and a bad case of hemorrhoids. The silver at your temples give you a distinguished look, and the hemorrhoids give you a proper note of grave concern. But when I was 1.5 years sober, this is for laughter, this is for tears. Hard teaching my stooges how to react here.